70 is perhaps a little bit catchier than the subtitle here, Age of Pension Eligibility, Gains in Life Expectancy and Social Policy. And I hope you're not too deceived by the more catchy version of it, should the pension age be raised to 70. But that's, I am going to spend some time on the particular age and the implications of different age choices. Let me start by saying this is joint work with my colleague Frank Denton at McMaster. This whole area has suddenly been thrust into the policy debate in Canada. The paper that I'm going to talk about now, there was a press release that came out the very day that the Prime Minister gave his out of the blue announcement in Davos about raising the age of eligibility for OAS benefits. That had simply not been part of the discussion at all. In Canada, there was no discussion having to do with the age of eligibility for public pension benefits until the Prime Minister suddenly did it. He raised it in Davos of all things. So the coincidence of his comment that day and the press release, I spent the next week, it seemed, on radio interviews across the country of all sorts. And I'm pleased that this isn't a radio interview. I find sound clips are difficult to deal with. So I'm much happier to have a possibility of a real discussion around this topic today. Now, when the Prime Minister made his announcement, he suggested that continuing to finance OAS was a bit of a crisis problem, that the increases in expenditures were so great that it just wasn't feasible. We had to do something about it, and it sounded sort of urgent and so on. I'm going to have a rather different take on that, as you'll see. So, what am I going to talk about? Well, I think in order to get this in context, I'll start off by talking about where we are headed demographically. So I'm going to talk about future population and the labor force. Everybody knows that the population's aging, but there's a considerable ignorance around how much aging is in prospect and when it's going to happen and so on. So we'll talk a bit about that. And then I'm going to provide a quick overview of the retirement system and focus on the public component of it, because much of this discussion is around the public component. And then I'm going to talk about life expectancy and how that fits into the public debate, I think, or should fit more into the public debate than it has in relation to the age of pension eligibility and the cost implications for publicly funded plans. So let me start with the population. Here's a plot of the size of the population going back to 1951 and going forward to 2051. The part from current up to 2051 is obviously a projection, but you'll see it's not far from being a straight line. It's pretty much linear growth over this period. Now, that's important to observe. There's continued growth in the population. Now, not only historically, but in the projection, there's continued growth. This assumes that things continue on more or less as they are or have been for some time. So the fertility rate is well below the replacement rate. Immigration continues on at about 250,000 a year with some out-migration, so we end up with a net gain of about 200,000 people a year, 1 million every 5 years from immigration. And with that, the immigration more than offsets the low fertility rate. As I say, it's well below replacement. And the population continues to grow, albeit slowly. Now, this is unlike many other developed countries, and it's important to know that in context. If we looked at a projection for Japan, it's down. If we look at a projection for many European countries, down. Okay? U.S. continues up. Their fertility rate is virtually the replacement rate, and there is continued immigration. But Canada does stand out in terms of, in the developed world, and having continued growth as far as we can reasonably anticipate. But because this is a straight line, anybody who knows anything about a straight line knows as you move further along the straight line, the rate of growth is declining, okay? Because it's a constant increment per year. And here's what's been happening in terms of the rate of growth. So the rate of growth was very high when the baby boom people were young, okay? All the births that were happening at that time. combined with some considerable immigration. As the baby boom came to an end, the rate of growth fell off. We've got a little jiggle here having to do with mostly with immigration, but then the trend is clearly towards lower and lower rates of growth. So here we've got a rate of growth of less than 0.5%, projected to grow at less than 0.5%, but per year, but continuing to grow, but slower growth. Now, slower growth means that the age distribution of the population is going to be moving towards the older end, because we've got, in particular, that big baby boom, which was back here, is going to move through the age distribution of the population. As we well know, the baby boom is now just at the cusp of 65, and another 20 years, that cusp will have moved, the end of the baby boom will be 65. So it's a completely predictable sort of thing. What about the labor force? Well, the projection of the labor force is quite different. It's linear growth up to about the present, but much slower growth looking into the future. We've really had almost all the growth in the labor force that we're going to have. There will be continued growth, but much slower growth in the labor force than in the population as we look ahead. So here's the highest rate of growth of the labor force, which is the baby boom entry. Remember, the high growth in the population is back here 20 years earlier. Well, the high growth in the labor force occurs 20 years after the peak in the baby boom. And then we've got an echo effect coming along here, and we're right in that at the moment. But that's fading, and the labor force is going to be growing at a projected rate of very close to zero as we move ahead, not very far. So labor force growth is coming to an end, assuming continued low, not low, but continuation of current levels of immigration. Labor force growth is going to be very, very slow as we move into the future. If there were a return to much higher fertility, that clearly won't have a very early impact on the labor force. It might even reduce the labor force growth as more women leave, at least temporarily, for child rearing purposes. And the increase in births, if it were to occur, wouldn't take place in the labor force, wouldn't impact the labor force for another 2 decades. So there's quite a gap to take place in that interval there. So much slower population growth in the prospect, but even sooner than that, much slower labor force growth. Now, as all of that happens, here's what's going to happen to the age distribution of or at least the percent of the population 65 and over. And it's worthwhile, I'm not going to focus on this particularly, but it's worthwhile just observing what's likely to happen across the country as this aging takes place, because it's very uneven. For Canada as a whole, well, we'll come back to that in a moment. For Canada as a whole, there's going to be substantial aging, but as I say, very uneven. So the bluer line here is the current situation, the proportion of 65 and older by province. And as we look out to 2050, the redder line is the projected proportion for 2050. So you'll see that Newfoundland and Labrador really stand out. Currently around 15%, which is close to the highest in the country, but up to 36 or so % as we look ahead. Why is that? Well, for 2 reasons. One is that Newfoundland has the lowest fertility rate in the country, and the second is it receives no immigrants, virtually no immigrants go to Newfoundland. So, greatest impact here. But you'll notice it's not very unlike the rest of the Atlantic provinces. The big increases are relatively concentrated in the Atlantic provinces. Certain amount in BC, which comes next, but really the concentration is in the Atlantic provinces, and the main reason there is they don't historically haven't attracted much by way of immigration from abroad, and also they tend to lose population to the rest of the country through internal migration. So with all of this, BC is the other big gainer. Ontario, of course, is somewhere pretty much in the middle, as always with these things. So if we take the extreme cases, here's Newfoundland and Labrador over the time period year by year going out to 2050. Here's Ontario going up to 2050. So the increase looking at more or less the current situation, which is right about here, about 14% of the population 65 and over in Ontario, and that will increase to about 26% or so. By 2030, when all of the baby boom has passed 65, the proportion will be about 25% in Ontario, given present trends. Manitoba stands out as having the lowest proportion. Any idea why that is? Have the biggest First Nation population with high fertility in that group, and so the proportion. Hello, Lynn.
Hi, Byron. I'm really sorry. I was working out.
Well, good for you. So are we.
Well, it's good for you. Then you can retire later.
So let me turn now to general concern or general question about population aging. And I'm telling you at the beginning, population aging is inevitable. Okay? There's nothing we can do about it. So we're going to have to learn to live with it. Now, when I say it's inevitable, what are the possible ways of avoiding population aging? Okay. Two things are usually identified. Anybody?
Have more babies.
Have more babies, that helps, and
Ever increasing influx of immigrants.
and have more immigrants. Okay, so what would those things do for us? Well, let me just, before I say that, here's the same projection that we looked at for the population, and here's the proportion, 65 and older. This goes out just to 2036 here is the latest. That happens to be how far this all goes. So, suppose we doubled immigration. Doubled immigration, so we're bringing in 450,000 people a year. What would that do? Well, it'd have a huge impact on the size of the population. Another 8 million people or so by this end of this projection period. But the proportion that would be 65 and older would not be all that much smaller. Okay, here we are now. The big story is substantial increase. Yes, it would reduce the proportion 65 and older, but it would still, I mean, the story really is continued big increase in that proportion. So some impact, but not a huge impact. What about higher fertility? Well, suppose that fertility suddenly went up to the replacement rate instead of being 25% below the replacement rate. What would that do for us? Well, again, it would result in lots of population growth, but it would result in a lesser impact on the percent 65 and older as we look ahead a quarter century. What else could we possibly do? Well, we could redefine what we mean by old. Okay? And I'm going to argue that's a pretty sensible thing to do. Redefine what we mean by old. And you see that has, relatively speaking, a very big impact. If you combine that with anything else, bigger impact still. Now, why would we want to think about redefining old? Well, the obvious reason is gains in life expectancy, and they've been going on forever. And so I'll come back to that point. And I am going to come back to it, but let me just take a bit of an aside here and talk about Canada's retirement income system, because this is the focus of the concern. Okay, we've got an aging population, and incidentally, I should say this as well. The population is aging for two reasons. One is the baby boom, and by far the biggest reason is the baby boom, okay, because we have that very large group of people born in the after Second World War period, roughly speaking from 1946 to 1966, two-decade period. Huge numbers of births relative to what came before and relative to what came after. So we've got a great bulge in the population. As that group works its way through the age distribution of the population, and they're now roughly 45 to 65, in 20 years they're going to be 65 to 85. Can't do anything about that. At least the survivors will be 65 to 85. And so that the sheer numbers of them is what's doing it. When we combine that with gains in life expectancy, which applies to everybody, not just the baby boom, then we've got the combined effect of aging of the population. So Canada's retirement income system. The first component is old age security, and associated with that, the Guaranteed Income Supplement, OAS, GIS. The second is the Canada and Quebec pension plans. I'm sure everybody in this room knows enough about them that I don't have to elaborate on what they are, although I'm happy to do so if that's helpful. So beyond that, so those are the public sources of what people have to rely on when it comes to securing themselves financially in old age. In addition to that, we can make private provision. And the private provision for retirement is in the form of having a registered retirement savings plan. You have to make your contribution by the end of the month. Employer pension plans, if you're working for an employer who has a pension plan, and some people are, but most people aren't. And you have your own savings. So that's what you can rely on privately, the upper parts what you can rely on publicly, the pillars of the retirement income system. Now, here are I'm going to focus on the public plan in the rest of what I have to say here. So, old age security, the maximum benefit you can get from old age security currently is $6,481 a year. That's the current rate. It's indexed to inflation, so changes in the consumer price index, which incidentally are now being, the CPI is now being reviewed, and it's likely that there won't be as much inflation in the future as there has been in the past, but that's a separate matter. So the maximum you can get, the average person who does get it gets $6,100. There's a bit less, and this is because of the clawback, mostly. The total cost of this program is $28.5 billion, or projected, was projected to be that. The numbers, final numbers aren't in yet. Was projected to be that for this fiscal year. How is it financed? It's from general revenues. So taxes are collected, and some of the tax payments are used, revenues are used to make those OAS benefits. Eligibility, 65 and over is the main thing. There are residency requirements if you come from abroad. If you're an immigrant, you have to have certain years of service and so on, years of residence. But basically, it's 65 and older, and it's universal, and it's not income tested or anything else. You get it by virtue of age. If your income is high enough, there's a clawback, but basically you get it. Guaranteed income supplement, people who are eligible for OAS, meaning you're 65 and older, are eligible for GIS if income is sufficiently low. That's the only test. Here's the average amount paid out for people who do get it, and there's the maximum amount you can get if you're a single person. And the total cost to the public purse of that is $8 billion a year. In addition to that, there's a spousal allowance. The spousal allowance is paid to the spouses of people who are 65 and older, and the spouse is eligible for OAS and eligible for GIS as well, because these benefits are paid to the spouse who's 60 to 64, not yet eligible for OAS, GIS, but low income, paid from general revenues. There's another $500 million. So we've got a total here of something in the high 30s billions of dollars, a bit short of $40 billion. CPP, the major part of CPP is the retirement pension. Okay? And now it's a contributory pension. Okay? You get CPP, retirement, or other benefits as a result of having paid into CPP in a monthly deduction from payroll. So it's contributory. The eligibility, 65 is the so-called normal retirement age, but you can get it earlier, as early as age 60 with a 30% discount, or as late as 70 with a 30% increment. Those rules are changing slightly. The benefit of waiting to 70 is going to be somewhat greater in the future, and I think maybe the discount for taking it at 60 is going to be a little bit greater. In any case, that's being skewed somewhat, but that's basically what it is. And in addition to that, there are other CPP things. There's a survivor benefit, there's a death benefit, and there's a disability benefit. Those things in total come to another 10 billion or so. So the total cost of CPP is of the order of $42 billion. So we're talking here about a combined total of lots of billions of dollars. It's an expensive thing to run. Incidentally, please don't hesitate to ask me questions at any point if you'd like. Now, here's a particularly important aspect of how the public system has an impact on people at different income levels. Okay? And one characteristic of the Canadian retirement income system, and the reason that it hasn't been deemed to be a crisis of the sort that we observe in much of Europe and elsewhere, is because it's very targeted. Okay? It's unusually targeted to low-income people. So along here, along the horizontal axis, we have average wages and salaries. And so this is somebody right here, 1 times average wages and salaries, is somebody who has earned an average wage or salary over a working life, an average. That person would get this much OAS benefit, would get this much CPP, so that I add, here's OAS, I'm adding, I get up to here for CPP, and then I add GIS. That person would also get some GIS. And the total amount would replace about 42, 43% of that person's wages and salaries when working. So the public system, the first pillar, would replace a bit over 40% of what you were used to earning. You're no longer earning, you get this instead. If you were a lower income earner, so you were much lower income earner, if you had only half, you would get a replacement rate of about 75%. So it's very generous at low income levels, modest, 43% or so replacement rate at average income levels, and then the replacement rate falls off sharply as we move to older ages. The OAS pays that maximum amount that we saw to everybody. Canada Pension Plan pays at most 25% of the average wage at the time that you retire. So 25% of the average wage. If you're a high income earner, you don't get 25% of what you are earning. You get 25% of the average wage from the CPP or Q. And then on top of that, you get whatever GIS benefit you might get. And if you're a high income earner, you don't get much GIS. Okay. So highly skewed towards low income people, which is great as a public system. It's also relatively low cost. Okay. If we look at the replacement rates in many parts of Europe, instead of going down like this as income goes up, they go like this. So if you've got a 70% replacement rate for everybody retired, you've got a very expensive system to finance. And that's the situation where there are crises. And if you combine that with even younger ages of being eligible to receive them, you've got a bigger problem still. So that's a good picture there. Now, let me turn to my topic about gains in life expectancy and the age of eligibility for these pension benefits. Some of you might remember, not everybody, the CPP and QPP were introduced in 1966, 45 years ago, 45 and a half years ago now. Guess what's happened since then in terms of life expectancy? Does anybody have an idea? How much has life expectancy increased since 1966? 45 years. Well, the answer is about 10 years for males. 10 years gain in life expectancy for males. And it's about 8 years for females.
How many for females?
8.
8.
Females used to gain faster. I mean, what that means is that the gap between male and female life expectancy is narrowed here. Males have gained more rapidly in recent years than females. So life expectancy has increased a whole lot since the Canada Protect Pension Plans were introduced. But the typical age of retirement has decreased. And it's lower now than it was in 1966, and by quite a bit. So we've got this funny business happening. People are living longer, retiring earlier. So obviously, and incidentally, a lot of people, of course, are entering the labor force later as well because they're doing a university degree or some college work or something, and then they're doing postgraduate degree, and by the time they get into the labor force, they're almost ready to retire. So there's this shortening gap there. So we combine this great gain in life expectancy with the fact that the baby boom is transitioning into retirement now, and we've got a combination that looks pretty serious. Okay? And what I'm going to be focused on in this next little while is just how bad a combination is that, how much do we have to worry about it. But certainly it gives rise to lots of concerns about increasing the burden of support across, for those who will be working when the baby boom has finished retiring, and they're all collecting the benefits that go with that, this public pension plan benefits that we're talking about. So there's concern about the inequities, intergenerational equities that could come about as a result of that. Those of you who are going to be working for the next 20 years and have to pay for this is the sense of it. And so how bad does it all look? So just to put this in one other little perspective here, here's a quote coming from the OECD recently. Indeed remarkable that despite increases in longevity, the effective age at which workers retire has tended to follow a downward trend in virtually all OECD countries, at least until recently. In the last 15 years in Canada, the age of retirement has been drifting up, most especially for males. For women, it wasn't been increasing right along, but for men, it's been drifting up for the last 15 years, but it's still far below what it was in 1966. 1966 being an important year when the CPP was introduced. So sort of our standard of reference in terms of if it was appropriate then, what's appropriate now is another way of asking the question. So let me do that population outlook that I showed you a bit ago, the projection. Let me show it to you in a slightly different way here. Here's the population as it was in 66. Here's the population as it was in 2010. Under 65, 65 and older, and the total. You'll notice the total increase was 14 million, but of that, relatively little. I mean, the population under 65 much less than doubled. The population 65 and over more than trebled. That's history. That's what happened. Now let's look ahead to 2035. So 25 years from here, a quarter century ahead. Suppose that there were no gains in life expectancy. We can project what the population would be. Same projections I looked at before, but just eliminate all gains in life expectancy. So the population would increase from 34 million to 40 million and 600,000 with no gains in life expectancy. The population 65 and older would be over 9 million as compared to the current 4.8 million. With continued gains in life expectancy, there would be another 800,000 people over the age of 65 by a quarter century from now. So life expectancy really does matter. Gains in life expectancy really do matter. In difference terms here, this whole gain in population size of 946 million, very heavily concentrated in the 65 and older group. In fact, 82% of it is in 65 and older. So there's some indication of population aging for it. Yes?
So your continued gains in life expectancy, are you assuming that at the same growth from 66 to 2010 to be the same in 2010 to 35, or what was your gains?
No, the history back here, those are observed
roughly 10 years in life expectancy between those years. Did you assume the same increase in gains between
the gains in life expectancy? The gains in life expectancy that are assumed here are the same rates of diminishing mortality occur in the future as in the past. Okay, the same continuation of rates of decline of mortality. Same rates of decline in the future as in the past. A very reasonable assumption. So we ought to plan as if life expectancies will continue to rise. It would be stupid not to. It would be ignorant not to. Life expectancy gains have gone on, documented have gone on for at least 180 years throughout Europe, Canada, and the U.S. And if you look over that whole period, and you look at the life expectancy, here's time along here. Here's life expectancy. The gains in life expectancy have been linear. If you take the leading country, the country with the highest life expectancy over time, the gains have been linear. And how great have they been? Well, in Canada, over the century ending in 2000, so 1900 to 2000, the gains in life expectancy were 30 years. 30 years. So that's 3 years every decade. A lot of gains in life expectancy. And subject to confirmation, but no reason to expect those gains to stop. We ought to plan as if they're continuing on. Here's a plot of what the age distribution of the population looks like now, or more or less now, the blue line, with the big bulge here associated with the baby boom. So this is the numbers of bodies by age along here. So here's the baby boom, okay, this big group here. If we go ahead a quarter century with continued gains in life expectancy, here's where that big bulge is in the future. Okay? It's now 75, 79, looking ahead a quarter century. Roughly in that area. And then, of course, it falls off very sharply with continued mortality, because even though we have gains in life expectancy, we do have continued mortality. The pinkish line here is the difference between continued gains in life expectancy and no gains in life expectancy. And those differences are quite large if you take the vertical gap between them, which is the difference in the population size. Okay, so I hope you're convinced we ought to be taking those gains into account. That's sort of the bottom line point there. We ought to be taking those gains in life expectancy into account. So here's another way of looking at it. In 1966, 70% of males could expect to reach age 70. 70% could expect to reach age 65. By 2010, it was 87% could expect to reach age 65. And those who did could expect to have a whole lot more years of retirement. Another way of saying it, 26% more males survived to age 65, and they had a third more years of retirement, expected retirement, by 2010. So I think we have to take that into account. We can't ignore those gains in the past and in the future. Another way of saying that is that to hold an age marker fixed, the marker of old age fixed, is absurd. Age 65 was chosen in Canada in 1966 for the CPP. It was based on 1934 legislation in the U.S. when it set up its Social Security system. That in turn was based on Bismarck in the late 1800s, who also chose age 65. So it's been a marker of old age for a very long time. Life expectancy over that period has increased enormously. So the marker of old age has to change. Has to change. So, retirement age policies. It is changing in every place except Canada, and now it's part of the discussion in Canada, thanks to Davos. I don't know what would have happened if the Prime Minister didn't go to Davos. Everybody would have come out there. So, in the U.S., there was legislation in 1983 that said in 20 years' time, we're going to start increasing the age of eligibility for full Social Security benefits. So that started in 2003, and the age is, by 2008, the age incremented by 2 months every year. So starting in 2003, you had to be 65 and 2 months old in order to get full benefits. And the next year, you had to be 65 and 4 months old, and so on, to get full benefits. By 2008, it was up to 66, and it's legislated to increase to 67, but that won't be completed until 2025. In Germany, it's on its way from 65 to 67, slowly, but it's on its way. In France, I've noted here from 60 to 62, this is the age of eligibility for early retirement benefits, not for full retirement benefits. they're on the way up, and full retirement benefits from 65 to 67 by the same date. In the UK, the legislation has changed, so it's now 65, will be 65 for women as it has been for men. That's going to increase to 66. There's a mistake here. I think this should be 2026. 66 for everybody, up to 67, up to 68 is what they're proposing at this time. All of that's still subject to review. And Canada does stand out with no yet determined policy about changing all of this. What I've put down here are just a few countries can be documented for all sorts of other countries as well. Canada really does stand out. So looking ahead, I've really said all this. If we that those gains are important and should be part of the discussion. So, what are the policy options? Well, my suggestion here is that we, I guess this isn't a suggestion, we'll look at several options. First option is let's do nothing. So I'll call that age of eligibility 0. Okay? So the age of eligibility remains at 65. Another option, suppose we started increasing this, and this paper was published last year. So the age of eligibility starts to increase by 1 month each year, starting last year. Can't do that retrospectively, but we'll think as if we did. And that it continues on until 2035. So a month every year of increase. So this year you'd have to be 65 in 1 month in order to get it, and then 65 in 2 months, and so on. The second option is that that's too fast. We can't implement it in 2011. We'll wait until 2016. We'll wait for 5 years to do it. Another possibility. Third possibility, do it starting right away, but increase it by 3 months every year, okay, instead of 1 month. Okay? Remember, in the U.S. it was 2, so this sort of encompasses those possibilities. The next possibility is we wait until 2016 to implement that policy, because we don't want to shake everybody up too quickly. And the final policy here is to allow it to increase in line with gains in life expectancy, rather than some arbitrary other number. This, like gains in life expectancy, are sort of arbitrary too. Incidentally, a lot of those European policy changes that I have, they've indexed it to, they've increased it to 67 by some date. Thereafter, indexed to gains in life expectancy. That's quite a common way of dealing with things outside of Canada, and incidentally also outside of the U.S. Okay, so suppose we take those different policies. If we do nothing, here's what's going to happen to the age-eligible portion of the population. And so this is the population 65 and over if we do nothing. The age-eligible portion of the population is going to increase from 14% to almost 25% over this 25-year period. That's what we saw before. Nothing changed there. If we said we're going to increase the age of eligibility by 1 month every year, then this portion that would be eligible to receive the pension, to receive those age demarcated benefits would fall like that, be that much of a benefit from you. If we waited for 5 years, it would have this effect. So by waiting, we clearly don't get as much benefit in terms of fewer numbers getting that public benefit. Okay, now and here's the most extreme case, where we do 3 months every year. This means that by 2030, the age of eligibility for benefits becomes 70. Okay? Age 70 instead of a current 65. So over a period of 20 years, the increase in the age of eligibility is gradually moved up to 70. And then it's fixed, and so this line is really parallel to that line up there, or close to it, as a result of that. If we wait 5 years to do it, we get the same end result, because people 70 are eligible to receive it, but it just moved parallel along here because we waited 5 years to do it. And finally, the green line is to index according to gains in life expectancy. So that has much of the benefit, different time path, and so on. So there are lots of ways of doing this, lots of ways of thinking of how such a policy might be introduced. But here are 5 together with doing nothing. Now, suppose we did nothing. Here's what's going to happen in terms of the ratio of the labor force, projected labor force, to the age-eligible population. If we do nothing, then the age-eligible population is 65 and older. The current ratio is almost 4 to 1. 4 people in the labor force for every person 65 and older. If we do nothing, we're on a ski slope here, it'll be down to 2 by 2035. We do nothing. So 2 people in the labor force for every 1 person 65 and older. That's arithmetic. Okay, that's pretty much where we're headed. It sounds ominous, doesn't it? If we introduce policy 1, so we increase the 1 month a year for a while, it would look like that. If we, whoops, wrong way. Sorry. If we waited for 5 years, it would do that. If we implemented the 83, so we go ahead 3 months every year, it would look like that. Much less substantial reduction in the ratio. I'm going the wrong way. If we waited for 5 years, it would look like that. And if we did it based on gains in life expectancy, it would look like this. So what's the big story? The big story is the ratio of the size of the labor force to the population eligible to receive these public benefits is going to decline. It's going to decline a whole lot. But it might decline as much as from 4 to 1, or if we look ahead to 2030, so we're only going ahead 19 years now, or 18 years, it might decline as little as 3 to 1. Okay, so it's almost down here to 2 to 1 or 3 to 1. We've got a big range of choices. And we have to choose, as a public policy matter, we have to choose somewhere in that interval. Of course, you can come up with other possibilities as well. Sorry, I keep going the wrong way here. What does this imply about contribution rates? How much is it going to cost us if we do these different things? Well, that's also a fairly straightforward calculation, it turns out. And let me explain this calculation. This is the only arithmetic I'm going to take you through here. So the contribution rate, how much it would cost us to finance the system, is the ratio of how much we pay out in benefits to the base on which those benefits are collected. We run a pay-as-you-go system. So how much do you pay out in benefits? Well, every person gets a benefit B, and there are people getting it, are retirees. So here's the per capita benefit per person getting it, and there's the number of people getting it. So the product of those two is the total payment of benefits. In the denominator, we have, I'm assuming that the benefits are going to be paid based on labor income. So here we have the size of the labor force, and here we have the average wage. So the ratio is just the total payment of benefits relative to the total amount of wages paid out in the economy. So if we impose the contribution rate on that denominator, the contribution rate would be the ratio of those two things. Now, the next simplifying step here, suppose we keep the ratio of benefits to wages constant, so that what we pay out in public benefit, OAS plus GIS plus CPP, QPP, is some fixed fraction of the average wage in the economy. Currently, it's 25%. That ratio is currently 25%. The amount that we pay out as benefits, those benefits combined, relative to the average wage is very close to 25%. Suppose we keep it at 25% as we look into the future. Now, keeping at 25% is not the current policy. The current policy is that CPP, QPP would be kept at roughly 25% at most. But OAS, GIS are indexed to prices, not to wages. They're not indexed to wages at all. And so if wages go up faster than prices, which we keep hoping might happen sometime, if that happened, then people would get less by way of benefits relative to the average wage. So what I'm assuming here in this projection is that that ratio remains constant, so that in effect the benefits are wage indexed. People who are retired share in productivity gains and the average wage gains that are going on, not just purchasing power. Okay, so if that's the case, and we keep that at 25%, so we fix that, then the total cost is going to change just in ratio to the number of retirees relative to the labor force. So it's a very straightforward type of calculation to do. So I'm going to assume that that ratio of benefit to wages is constant, and then as I say, the contribution rate would vary directly. So what's going to happen to the contribution rate? So this also says that the whole system is financed on a pay-as-you-go basis. That's what that says. So we've got wages, we're imposing it all on wages, and we do it all as pay-as-you-go. That's not the case currently, quite, because the Canada Pension Plan, the Quebec Pension Plan are partially funded, but they're not heavily funded. They're not mostly funded. So it's not a bad approximation to say that this is the case. In any case, that's the approximation that we work with here. So what it would currently cost us is about 6.5% of the wages, of all wages and salaries would be required to pay current benefits. Okay? That's what it is now. If we do nothing, it would increase to about 12.5% over the next 25 years. Now that sounds sensible, doesn't it, in terms of what else I've said, because the proportion of the population, the number of people, the proportion of the population 65 and older is going to double relative to the labor force. And so the cost of providing support to them on exactly the same basis as we do now would approximately double. Okay? So there it is. Now, what are the implications of the alternatives? Well, if we raise the age of eligibility gradually, of course, it's going to be lowered. Okay? It's going to cost less. So here are the different values that we could look at. So if we took the most extreme case that I've looked at here, increase the age of eligibility to 70, this comes back to the title of the presentation now, if we increase the age of eligibility to 70 over a 20-year period, then the cost would go up, contribution rate would go up from about 6.5% to 7.2% or something like that. Be a very modest increase. But if we did nothing, it would go up to somewhere around, well, by the end of this projection period, to 12.5%, something like that. Now, 12.5% is not a crisis. Do you know what's already contributed to Canada Pension Plan? Okay, 9.9%. And in lots of European countries, for the purpose of maintaining their retirement income system, contribution rate is already far above this. So nobody, I think, should be calling this a crisis if we did stick with exactly the current situation, which is this line right here. I don't think that's a crisis. But there's a social choice. Okay? We've got a social choice here of where we want to fit in this whole spectrum. And that has a lot to do with how much of the gains in life expectancy we want to take as retirement gains. If we keep the age marker fixed at 65, then the sense of that is that all of the gains in life expectancy are taken in retirement. If we let it increase gradually, then we're sharing those gains between additional years of work and additional years in retirement. So it's a public policy choice. And the implication of it, one implication of it in terms of these things that we're showing here, are the contribution rate that will be imposed on the then working population. Because I mean, those of you who aren't yet 65, if you look out here, or won't be 65 over the next couple of decades, would you rather be paying contribution rates closer to 7% or closer to 10, 11, 12%? I mean, there is that sort of choice. I don't regard it as being a crisis in any direction at all, but there's a real choice to be made. And I think that's the nature of the choice and the nature of the trade-off. So when I say I have a take on this that's quite different from the Prime Minister who represented it as being a big crisis, I don't think it's a big crisis at all. And in fact, the Parliamentary Budget Officer, Kevin Page, came out a few days ago and said, not a crisis. And I had a note, actually the same day, I was quite surprised, a note from the chief actuary of the Canada Pension Plan, a person that I've known for a number of years. And he said, gee, that's exactly in line with what we've been projecting. So no surprise there. So we, the chief actuary, have been projecting.
So Byron,
Yeah.
why is the government saying it's a crisis?
Well, it's hard to do anything about something if you don't think it's a crisis, I guess. So by making it a crisis, it's sort of in line with changing the criminal law, isn't it? It has to be a crisis in order to act on it. So let's pretend there's a crisis and we'll act on it. I don't know. I mean, I don't have a better answer than that.
But CPP has said it is adequately funded, and it's not funded by the government, it's funded by all of us. Employers and workers, you do it. So they say they're good at least now to 2075. Why are you including CPP in here?
Well-
Because I don't think many people in this room may realize at the present time, the current maximum amount you get per year from CPP is between $11,000 and $12,000. Sounds great. It's very, very little. So if CPP says they're safe, and they know the population projections, let's then look at the OAS GIS. And I think what's missing is it takes you 40 years to qualify for full OAS. 40 years. So if for the full benefit of OAS, after you're 18,
Do you mean CPP or do you mean?
OAS takes 40 years.
You just
If
have,
you-
if you're living in Canada during
Yes,
that time. you
from the
qualify.
age of 18. So you're 58 if you've been born here, right? If you're an immigrant that came in 1981,
No, but
the
sorry,
employment
you
has-
still don't get the benefit until you're 65.
Oh, yeah, but the point is, it depends how long you've been in the country. So many, many people don't even come close. After 10 years, you get a quarter, right? 25%, which is quarter of about $560 a month. Come on, we're not talking about a lot of money. So I think it's important, one, to leave the CPP out of this. Let's look at the OAS, GIS, and the allowance. But to
Okay.
include CPP in, that's another issue.
Well, it really isn't another issue, and let me tell you why. The CPP maximum benefits right here. I think
Yeah.
You were wondering what it was, pretty sure.
I said between 11 and
Yeah,
12,000
It's close
a
to
year.
12,000 now, the maximum. The average, though, is much less.
That's right.
And the OAS maximum is here, the average is here. I said that the average is less partly because of clawback, but you're quite right. More importantly, it's less because a lot of people who are receiving those benefits are people who arrived in Canada and haven't been in Canada for 40 years. So they get proportionately less. But of course, most people who do immigrate to Canada come well before old age. So they
Yeah.
do get,
But if you come at 40, you're going to be 80 before you're qualified.
No, that's true. And at 65, you get 25, 40th of the benefit. So I'm not disagreeing with that, but your first question was why is CPP included in here when it's funded? The answer is that it's partially funded, and it's only partially funded. This incidentally is designed to show the implications of the whole system, the whole retirement income system as it now exists. The CPP is indeed partially funded, but the current payments that come out are part of gross domestic product. And gross domestic product is going to be generated by people who are currently working as we move ahead, combined with the existing capital stock at the time. Now, the funding of the CPP matters. I'm not disputing that at all. but the funding is only enough to pay 4 years of benefits. That's what it's designed to do. It's not fully funded in the sense that a private pension plan is. I'm not suggesting it's insecure or anything else, but it's quite properly part of the analysis the way it's done it here. Yes.
I understood that you don't get old age security if your income is over 100 and something thousand.
Well, it's
You don't get it at all.
No,
It's taxed
you
now.
get it,
Oh,
but it's
you
fully
get it.
clawed back.
You don't get it
Well-
because they take it
Yeah.
before they
You-
give it to you.
They take it before.
They put it in one hand and take
Right,
it from
so
the other.
you could take off.
But those are the high income people. You get, it's fully it's taxed back starting at around 69,000, and it's fully taxed back if your income is 125 or
69,000 you
something
start
like that.
losing it. Right.
69, you start losing it. You lose 15 cents on every dollar over 69,000 approximately.
What I think was your figure, excuse me for interjecting, but what I think your figure was important, the earlier graph where you showed the impact of OAS and GIS on low income, because what it's done is taken massive numbers of people out of poverty. And if you look at people's income before that government transfer, about 33% of unattached older people are below the low-income cutoff.
No, I'm absolutely in agreement with you. And that's what I said about this
Absolutely.
being very effectively targeted.
Crucial.
Yeah, very effectively targeted.
Yeah.
I mean, we can argue about whether the levels should be moved up or what they should be, just exactly how they should be. But no, it's been a remarkable benefit in Canada to have this combination of OAS and GIS and Canada Pension Plan, and that combination has moved lower income people, older people, out of poverty. We have perhaps the lowest poverty rate among older population in the world.
Only
It's-
after the transfer.
Oh, absolutely, but the transfer is the reason.
No.
Oh, yeah, I'm in full agreement with you. But it's remarkable, it really is among the lowest poverty rates in the world. Okay? We have a very low older poverty rate. Doesn't mean it's negligible or we shouldn't be worried about these, but it's really low by international standards.
This is a stupid technical question. StatsCan changed from before taxes to after taxes measurement of poverty using the LIFO. Why did they do that?
I don't know.
Or like, what, no, but what is the benefit of doing that? Never mind what for StatsCan, what is the benefit for measuring how far people are below the low income cutoff?
Well, the measurement of poverty is really arbitrary to
Right.
begin with. I mean, there's no
That's
question
right.
it's arbitrary. But if you take some agreed measure and you say, for example, we'll call anybody as being, we'll define somebody as being in poverty if other things equal, that person has less than a quarter of the average industrial wage. I mean, that's sort of a standard definition. So it's relative income. It's not absolute income, it's relative income. And then the further question is, are we going to talk about it before tax or after tax? There's a lot of arbitrariness. If you want to think in terms of what the person actually has to spend, of course you want after-tax income. But if you're talking about very low-income people, they're not paying tax, at least income tax. But of course they're paying tax on purchases and goods and service tax and all that stuff. So I mean, there's a clear element of arbitrariness in that.
It
The
just
whole
strikes
market
me
is
that it's
quite high.
always lower when it's after tax compared to before, which it would be.
Yeah.
But it gets so low, you start to think to yourself, well, poverty doesn't matter, but I think it does.
Yeah, and it's true that if you change that marker of poverty, I mean, just like the marker of old age.
Just
I've
like
been
the age
emphasizing,
marker you're talking about.
If you change the marker of poverty from saying 25% of the average wage to 28% of the average wage, it has a big impact of the number of people who are under that marker. Just as changing the age of old from 65 to 66 to 67 has a big impact on a fraction of the population. And if we apply that change to decide who is eligible for publicly funded benefits, it has a big impact on the cost of those benefits. Yes.
So another factor that plays a big role in these forecasts is the rate of life expectancy gains, right? And you talked about that earlier, and you said it would be ignorant not to assume some continued gains.
Yes.
So then the question becomes, although I think some could take issue with that, given that we've got an oncoming epidemic of complex chronic disease, multimorbidities, obesity, all of that is that for we've got childhood obesity rates that are skyrocketing. So there is some argument that we might actually see some decreasing in certain populations anyway. But assume that we do see some continued gains, and the question becomes, at what rate are those gains going to continue? You know, you mentioned in the century, in the 20th century, it increased by 30 some odd years.
30 years.
30 years from 1900 to 2000.
In Canada.
Yeah, many of those gains are to be attributed to public health interventions.
Yeah.
You know, it's hygiene, safe drinking water, safe workplaces, really dealing
Especially
with
in the early part of the
yeah,
century.
exactly. So therefore, that counters against continuing that rate. I don't think we're going to see another 30 years by 2100, right?
We don't know.
There's a-
But if you
We
look
don't
back,
know, but any of those discoveries that vaccines, penicillin, those were one-time things that had huge gains. Huge. It wasn't medical. It wasn't surgeries. It was public health interventions that we discovered that happened one time during that century that are not likely to be discovered again. Now there could be some of
Those things-
vaccine, whatnot.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I was
So
gonna
the
say-
issue becomes then, if you continue that assumption through the next century, another 30 years or so, percentage-wise, really even higher maybe, it actually lends credence to the fear mongers, right? Because you're increasing the lifespan, and much of that is going to be not in the labor force. So you have to have more funds to provide to those people that are spending more time not in the workforce.
well, let me put the comment to you, respond to you by saying the following. The projections that you've just looked at assume continued gains in life expectancy in line with recent history. Okay? So that those mortality rates continue to fall in the projection period at the same rate that they declined in the last 30 years or so. The projections, if we do nothing, we've got quite a manageable situation in terms of maintaining the publicly funded system. Okay? Of retirement income security. It's not in jeopardy to touch.
Right.
So I think that we ought to pay attention to those continued gains in life expectancy. They might not turn out to be that great. They might turn out to be greater. This is a big dispute in the demographic literature about precisely what's going on there. The people whose opinions I respect most think it's going to continue on in spite of the negative aspects that we've suggested. I mean, this is not a once and for all policy. We should continue to adjust policy in the light of realizations, not just expectations, but realizations too. So if the gains in life expectancy are at a slower rate in the future, then the policy should adjust. But see, one policy that has not adjusted is age 65.
Right.
Bismarck.
Right, exactly. I think when Bismarck set that age, the vast majority of Germans didn't reach that age.
Of course.
Right?
Exactly.
So it's very
Exactly.
cynical.
No, exactly, but it has remained the age.
Right, right.
But now we're talking about the 40 is 60 or whatever, 60 is 40, you know, like I'm 67 and I feel like 40. So there's obviously going to be a huge number of people who are going to be healthier as
Yeah.
they get older.
No, we clearly observed that.
You know, you're not sure.
So in those countries where they do peg it to life expectancy, actual life expectancy, how do they go about doing that? Is it similar to CPI where every year they make an adjustment?
So that in order to, in Sweden, it's currently indexed to gains in life expectancy. So if you retire, if you wanted to retire this year, you could determine the age at which you would get full benefits. And if you wanted to retire the year after. I mean, it's spelled out. It's based on what's happened recently, and there's enough warning that people can plan at least a little bit ahead, but you can project what the gains are going to be. Yes.
How do you see the changes in age impacting, even for everyone, the defined benefit programs that are being offered by the employers? Because right now they also use minimum retirement age, age 65, in their actual plans themselves.
Well, that's true. The defined benefit plans, though, have have formulas associated with them, and they don't have to stop at 65. I mean, this is part of what ought to be a bigger package. If you start to make changes, unlike what the Prime Minister said, talking about only OAS-GIS, I think at the very least, if you're going to talk about public plans, you want to be talking about CPP as well. That gets Quebec into the picture because you should be talking about QPP at the same time. But I think you have to talk about that package together. And when you start to do that, the private employer pension plans are usually integrated with CPP, QPP. So that again ought, I mean, that's a whole package of stuff that has to be taken into account jointly. And it just ought to be done as a package, not separate. But it's not something that's going to be done overnight. It's something that can be taken into account and changed gradually. So there's lots of time to work it out. But I agree, that's a complication that should be addressed as part of it.
I'm just thinking there's going to be an impact with environment too.
Sure.
The contribution rates that are going to be impacted.
Yes.
You're going to also want to adjust the unreduced retirement dates, and there's a greater impact, which is changing age.
But member defined benefit plans are going the way of the dodo. They're going. So it's increasingly defined contributions, which could be practically nothing, depending on if you're an idiot and how you invest, or you have a good investor and assume you have the money and pay, but with outsourcing, remember, pressure on pay scales come down. Many contracts say older workers stay at your rates, new workers come in heck of a lot lower. So if you start to think of the costs of your old age, your odds of getting a high income are dropping. Not to be pessimistic, but
And one thing that also bears, when it comes into this discussion, is there are relatively few people who have private pension coverage at all. I mean, far less than half of the working population now has that. And that has been, I mean, I'm pleased to say in a way, that has been a major consideration in discussions about pension reform in Canada. Age of eligibility hasn't come into discussions until just now, but the coverage has, and that's a positive. So there'd be a lot more people who would be eligible to get some private pension benefits at age 65 or whatever the age is. At least they might have some, whereas now most people don't. Is there anything else?
I've got a quick question for you. So related to the issue of private pension, of course you have to have a job to have a private pension, right? So when you were talking earlier about the number of years that people are spending in the life force, it's kind of shrinking at both, it's being compressed on both ends. Younger people are spending more time in education, seeking advanced degrees, and you kind of said in jest that by the time these kids get into the labor force, they're getting ready to retire.
Mm-hmm.
So if we, part of what's at play there is that there aren't jobs waiting for these people. So they stay in school or they travel across Europe and they come back, still nothing, guess I'll do another degree, whatever, right? I'm one to speak, I'm still in school myself. But what happens is if you start increasing the age of eligibility, people are gonna stay in the workforce longer, right? To get the full benefits. So then you're actually delaying further the opportunity for younger cohorts to enter the labor force.
This is the fixed pie, right?
Yeah, exactly. So how do you address that? How is
Well,
that
I would
negative
address that
consequence?
by arguing that we shouldn't think of the economy as a fixed pie. We divvied up. We should think in terms of growing pie and not force people out at the older end in order to bring more people into the younger end, because that's clearly in the direction of failed policies. That is something that has been tried in a number of countries, including most notably perhaps France and Italy, where the retirement age was reduced. People were encouraged with generous public pensions to retire. Greece probably fits into that category too. And so they've lost the benefit of older productive workers without gaining the benefit of young ones, because they didn't come into those jobs that weren't created. I mean, what we've got there is a bigger macroeconomic policy of having sufficient growth to accommodate the population that wants to work and can work productively. We don't want to confuse that with proper policies regarding age of pension eligibility.
No, and it's all well and good to wish and hope for a growing pie, but we have to, based on reality. Don Drummond certainly isn't forecasting a larger pie, right?
I agree, he isn't, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be doing things to try to enlarge the pie. Those policies are quite separate from the policies that I've been talking about.
Right, but it's the same economy.
It's the same economy, but the appropriate ways to address an economy that isn't growing as rapidly as you want to are not the same policies that you'd use to address retirement age considerations and pension coverage and all.
Do you know, one thing that's forgotten, maybe I'm old enough to remember, when old age security came in, there was a surtax to pay for it. We paid a surtax on top of your income. Then that got rolled in. And everybody forgets that in fact there was an increase in income tax to pay for old age security. And when it first came in, I can remember a man who worked all his life in the CN yards in Montreal, emigrated at 17 from Scotland. He worked till he was 80 when he died, because his pension, nothing from CN, they didn't pay pensions, $4 a month. So OAS has improved over the years, but in fact, it was a separate item on our income tax. We did pay for it, and it's got lost because it's rolled into whatever the percentage is. And if you don't know that history, you think, oh, it was government beneficence that gave it to us. No, you paid for it.
Well, we still pay for it.
Yeah,
I mean,
through our
it's all,
income
sure,
tax.
it's all through the income tax, if it's paid out of general revenues or however it's paid, we're paying for it.
Yep.
We should not regard these things as free, that they're part of the
Sure.
income distribution or redistribution system.
So many things. What about the GIS? It's based on your income, not on your savings.
It's
You can
income
have-
tested.
You can have a whole lot of savings and still get the guaranteed income stuff.
Well, if your savings are generating any income.
No,
you
no,
can't.
in your RSP, let's say.
Well, if it's generating income,
No.
the test is against your income. So,
That's right, if you're not getting income, it's like.
Yeah.
They force you
But
to
you
start
have
taking,
to.
they force you to take your RSPs.
Oh,
at a certain age.
Yeah,
So then
that's.
it's-
so you're not eligible.
you're eligible for, I mean, it is a very well-targeted program.
No.
You're eligible to keep your OAS if your income's sufficiently low, and you're eligible to have GIS on top of it if your income is sufficiently low. It's a very targeted program, which makes it, as I said before, relatively cheap to keep going, and results in a very, very low poverty rate in this country. Okay. Well, could I take a vote? How many people would think it sensible to increase the age of eligibility for publicly funded plans, pension plans, retirement income security sorts of things, gradually, starting in the not very distant future. How many would think it not reasonable? Well, pretty much everybody says it's reasonable.
Well, some people do.
Did I have hands up for
I
not
want the
reasonable?
evidence. I don't have the evidence.
Okay. I did notice an item in the paper, yes, incidentally, in these many phone calls that radio interviews that I had, some of them were with people who were calling in. I fortunately didn't have to answer the people who were calling in, but I had to listen to them. And, which perhaps is just as bad. But there did not seem to be a whole lot of resistance to the idea of increasing the age of eligibility. I was surprised. And I saw a little item in the Globe and Mail yesterday, I think, maybe the day before, saying that based on some poll, that it seems to be sort of general acceptance of the idea that it's not a bad policy to think about at least discussing raising the age of eligibility.
Is that only for CPP or for both?
They were talking about OAS in that.
I think what you'd have to look at,
You have to look at the whole package.
you have to look at poverty. Because if you go into Stats Canada and you look at the pre-tax poverty rate, it's high, which means government transfers are phenomenal in reducing poverty.
Yeah.
So the moment you defer for really low income people, you're saying to them, you're staying way lower than anybody else in society to your 67 or 68, assuming they can. So
Okay,
it would have to be you'd have
Yeah,
to look.
let me just comment on that. One other aspect of everything that I've talked about that should be integrated in this reconsideration is the disability benefits as well. Many people who stopped working, and especially who stopped working quite young, in their 50s and maybe even in their early 60s, but especially those who quit in their 50s. There are a few cases of people who are just high income or quit for all sorts of reasons, but I think that most of those people who quit do so for reasons of disability. They're not large numbers, but I think that by and large they are claiming disability benefits. So the disability benefit claims, or at least the legislation relating to that, the regulations relating to that, would also have to be adjusted in line with this. So at the moment, you cannot claim disability benefits after age 65. That's when your OAS, GIS kick in. So if OAS, GIS age increased, then age of disability benefits would have to increase along with that. Because, to deal with the various sorts of things that we're talking about, avoiding poverty among such people.
Gerda's question prompted me to think about the ODB. Is that being considered for a potential increase in eligibility for that as well?
Sorry,
The Ontario Drug Benefit for Seniors.
Oh, I have no idea whether that's part of any discussion or not. I've certainly heard it mentioned.
Right,
Yeah.
because that's a huge ticket issue.
Yeah.
So if you increase the OAS to 67, what happens to the poor that don't have any other income? Would they get GIS? No, they wouldn't. So
Well,
what would they
the
live
current,
on?
the current arrangement is you don't get GIS if you're not eligible for OAS.
Exactly.
Right,
You're
so
talking-
then how would they survive?
Well, you're talking about people who are 65, 66,
Yeah.
who haven't yet received.
Right.
Well, if they're eligible for disability, for example, they get that.
Yeah,
If the age went up there. I mean,
they'd have to be on welfare.
look, there are a whole lot of things that are involved in this, and I don't pretend to have solved all of them. But the general message that I'm trying to get across is we have to think about the age 65 marker. If it was appropriate 45 years ago, it's no longer appropriate. The problems 45 years ago with poverty among the elderly were much, much bigger than they are now. Much bigger than they are now, by orders of magnitude. So, yes, we need to address matters of poverty among the elderly population at this point, but we need to do it in the context of thinking about this age marker, marker of old age and who's eligible for these benefits. Yeah.
What explains the Canadian exceptionalism with being the only country that's really stuck at 65?
Well, I think it's this. I think it's that that we have a retirement income security system, publicly funded retirement income security system, which is so heavily targeted at low-income people that it's relatively cheap to run. So we spend a much smaller fraction of government budgets on transfers to older population than most countries in Europe, or I think even in the U.S. The social security system in the U.S. replaces a higher fraction of income for higher income people than is the case in Canada, a notably higher fraction. So it's more expensive. So it's this targeting that I think really is at the bottom of much of it.
So to help address this concern that by increasing the age of eligibility, what you're doing for some people is extending years of poverty until they then qualify, and then it's like hitting the jackpot. Now I qualify for these sources of income. Right, right. Well, for some people, it's probably, you said it's significant, right? It gets them out of poverty. Could you means test it? We're currently means testing at the high end, right, to claw back high income earners. Could you means test it at 65, and if you're below a certain set limit, you qualify, and this upward increasing doesn't apply to the
Well, the disability benefits are more generous in OAS.
Way more.
So if the people who are going
They may
to
not
lose
be
benefits
disabled.
at 65 are getting disability benefits, then we'd be
But if
better
they
off
don't have,
continuing to
Yeah,
get.
they may not be disabled.
Well, I mean, those are things to be addressed in part of the context of worrying about the income security system and how it deals with low-income people, whatever their age, and whatever their circumstances. Sometimes you want to find ways in which they can become employable, and for other people it's simply not a suitable option, and to deal with there. And I'm quite in favor of all those things happening. That's just a bit aside from the main focus of what I've been talking about. But it's certainly part of what you're going to address, and would have to address in changing the age of eligibility for publicly funded benefits.
I'm just wondering, excuse me, about the reciprocal pension benefits, which I know aren't very high from other countries. And whether if we raise the age, which I totally think we should, I totally agree with you. What impact will that have on the reciprocal pension plans in other countries, which tend to be around 65?
Well, they're
We'll have to
going
work
up
something
too.
out, I guess,
Well,
right?
yes, the answer is yes to that.
Yeah.
But those ages of eligibility are going up in most of the other countries with which we have any reciprocal arrangements. So again, it would have to be worked out.
It'd have to be worked out.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things that are dependent on this that
Yeah.
often you don't think
No,
about.
that's right. No, when you start to, there are two observations. One is if you try to change anything, it's much more complex than you ever thought it would be. But the other is if you start to change anything, there are a lot of people with vested interests in whatever the current thing is, however awful it might be. There are a lot of people that have vested interest in keeping the status quo, even though it's demonstrable from any sort of social benefit, social policy benefit, that it would be much better off by changing it. You're going to get resistance. So. And that's not just a Rob Ford comment.
most of the countries where we have reciprocal pension agreements are not now the major source of our immigration, are they?
I think that's true.
So
The
when
major
they're-
source of immigration is Asia, and there are very few countries in Asia
That's
that have
why-
any notable
Exactly.
pensions.
And blacks are the third group from Africa and the Caribbean. And we do have a lot of arrangements with the Caribbean. That's it. But Asia is much more difficult.
Yeah.
Because it is
And so we're seeing the poverty rate
in those.
in those populations soar, which is alarming.
It's a tiny number. I mean, it's terrible. The proportion of older people coming into this country is very small. And I think they're even going to change immigration, maybe to do something about it. with this government. I'm not saying I agree with that. I don't.
But the people who change residence, at least outside of a narrow geographic bound, are younger people,
Oh, yeah. It's
typically,
not older.
unless you're talking about moving into a retirement home or something like
It's
that.
very small, it's like 6%, and it's usually bringing, an older parent over to care for children, or to help out, or
Yes.
they're the only person left, and they should be in the family. Sorry.
Quite so. Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Well, thank you, that was great.